I just finished reading Chapter 3 of the Conjugal Dictatorship, and this chapter specifically focuses on the declaration of martial law and what was going on around the time of September 23 when it was declared. It's a very interesting chapter for me because I learned a lot about, I guess, the political climate at the time in the Philippines and what people were expecting that was going to happen. I didn't know, for example, that the fact that Marcos declared martial law was not at all a surprise for many people, and they actually expected it. Many politicians actually left in the months before he declared martial law, and some people, even up to the very end, knew about it and decided to stay because they wanted to be national heroes. According to Mijares, he describes it as, for many politicians, it felt like a badge of honor to be arrested by the military. And so they purposefully wanted to stay in the country and be arrested because if they didn't, they would be looked at as traitors to the kind of the oppositional cause against Marcos. You can't leave the Philippines. So even if they knew that Marcos was about to declare martial law, they couldn't really leave because if they left, it would be like they would be like a traitor to the country. So there seems to be strange political motives about why they didn't leave before the imposition of martial law, but also it seemed like an open secret that it was going to happen eventually. And so I don't know, it's a weird thing to consider that they actually all knew that it was going to happen, and when it happened, they all just, some of them even just went kind of got themselves arrested, or they went straight to the stations to get arrested. They went straight to Camp Aguinaldo, and all of this stuff. Anyway, for those who are watching this out of context of the first two videos I made, over the next few weeks I plan to read for the very first time The Conjugal Dictatorship, which is a very controversial book written by someone who was in the inner circles of Marcos's, administration. And he defected in 1974-75 and wrote this book and had it published in 1976 in the United States. Where he was there exiled, and right after he published it, a few months after, he disappeared, and no one has heard of him ever since. Why he disappeared or what happened is unclear. Some people say he was probably murdered. Some people say he was dropped off in an airplane, as he was trying to leave to Hawaii or something, he fell in the ocean. Some people claim that he actually just got hush money and disappeared. Some people say they've seen him with another woman in the United States, where I guess he has continued to live. So all sorts of different stories. Even his own family doesn't necessarily say he was murdered. His family says that they don't know, and for them it's still a mystery as well, and they're not jumping to any conclusions. At least that's what I read from one of their interviews. His fate may not have been clear, but his own son was brutally murdered and possibly thrown out of a helicopter around the time when the book came out, or after the book came out. Some people claim that, and again, there's so many rumors, I don't want to go into all of the rumors, but it's a mystery what happened to him, but his son was murdered. As I talk about, so again, I want to read this for the first time because it's a very important book, and I think that as we're approaching the next presidential election cycle, it's important for us to be very educated about the Marcos administration and martial law, because as we all know, this is going to be talked about a lot over the next few months once the presidential cycle starts rolling, and it's important to get ahead of the curve, so when the time comes when they talk about it, we'll have a better way to understand it, and we'll already know at least the contents of one of the main sources of, one of the main voices of criticism for the Marcos administration is Mijares. And so a lot of the arguments that will be used against and for Marcos will have something to do with Mijares in his book, for sure. And again, it's just such an important book because we don't have anything quite like it. So this chapter specifically focuses on the martial law declaration. But I want to talk about, the chapter kind of goes in and out of different time zones, or different time periods. It's not very linear. So I want to reframe the story chronologically by starting with a news article that was published on January 21 that I was really surprised to read, talked about here. Actually, January 23, 1971. So a year and a half before martial law was declared, this news article was published on the Free Press that was positing what the Philippines would look like once martial law is declared. So again, a year and a half before he actually officially declared it, it seemed like people already knew about it. They were already contemplating what society will be like once he declares it. Here's what the news article says, or I guess it was an opinion piece or whatever you call it. Under the Free Press, January 23, 1971, half a year before Plaza Miranda was bombed, and a year and a half before he actually officially declared martial law. With the courts and Congress reduced to impotence and the independent press shut up, with publishers who dared to disagree with Marcos placed under house arrest or in concentration camps, where they would be joined sooner or later by outraged justices of the Supreme Court, senators and representatives who would not lick the boots of Marcos, as well as others who would not submit to tyranny. The nation will be polarized. The Philippines would be divided into Marcos collaborators and those who love liberty and are branded misguided elements and declared enemies of the Marcos state. Life under a regime of martial law or a Marcos military dictatorship would be little different from life during Japanese occupation. How many would submit to it? How many would submit to it? And how would Marcos ever dare restore civil law? Would he dare to leave Malacanang? Would he not be compelled to declare himself president for life? That is, dictator forever. And how long would forever be? So it seems to be the case that even before Marcos declared martial law, in a year and a half before he did so, people already knew about it. People were writing news articles or opinion pieces about what martial law would look like, and it was not a surprise to anyone when he finally declared it a year and a half later. On August 21, 1971, so 7 months after this piece was written, Plaza Miranda was bombed. It's important for me to talk about Plaza Miranda because it's one of the most contentious events in Philippine history, and I'll talk a little bit about why. The Plaza Miranda bombing was an event in Philippine history that happened on August 21st, 1971, where there was a Liberal Party political rally going on, and as you know, where different politicians who were running on the ticket would give speeches. Ninoy Aquino was set to give a speech in that night as well, and as it approached midnight of the evening at Plaza Miranda, suddenly bombs started going off, and some of the politicians were injured, and it was a big controversial event because it was then used because of the bombing of Plaza Miranda. Marcos he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which kind of limited the ability for average people to exercise free speech. When it was declared, when the bombing happened, many people assumed it was Marcos who was in charge of it, because again, at this time, as I talked about in the previous news article kind of excerpt, people knew that Marcos was planning to declare martial law at some point. People knew he was, wanting to extend his power in the presidency. Especially after the very corrupt 1969 elections, people kind of knew that this guy is someone who really wants to stay there and stay there for a very long time. And so the moment that the bombing happened, they all assumed, well, it must be Marcos has something to do with it, because, right after he declared the suspension of writ of habeas corpus, of course, he started getting harder on his critics, on the critics in the media. He had a harder line on them. At the time, Marcos said that the people who were behind the Plaza Miranda bombing were the communists, and he even said that Ninoy Aquino was behind it, because he said that Ninoy Aquino has communist ties, and Ninoy Aquino wasn't even there during the bombing, which means that he knew that the bombing was going to happen that night, and he decided not to go because he didn't want to, get injured or die because of the bombings. And at the same time, again, most historians, even the United States government, the CIA, in their documents say that they think Marcos was behind the bombing. So on one hand, you have many people thinking Marcos was behind it because he's trying to maintain and expand his powers. And at the same time, Marcos claims that it was the communists who were in charge of it. And what makes it more complicated is that a few decades after, some people from the Communist Party claimed they were involved with it. Some people claimed that they were actually ordered by the leader of the Communist Party, Jose Maria Sison. So again, most people feel like Marcos was behind it, but some members of the Communist Party themselves claim that Sison was behind it. And we don't have any confirmation either way. We don't have very hard proof to show who was behind the Plaza Miranda bombings. Either way, whoever was behind it, it helped the cause of Marcos in kind of furthering his case for eventually declaring martial law at the end of 1972. What is this thing about Ninoy Aquino having kind of ties with the communists? Is there any kind of truth in this? This is a very controversial topic, and I kind of hesitate to talk about it because it's not really in the scope of this book. But there seems to have been a relationship between Ninoy Aquino and Bernabe Buscaino, who was the person who was the leader of the NPA, which was the militant faction of the Communist Party of the Philippines. I think Bernabe Buscaino, or Commander Dante, would he would go to Hacienda Luisita. I think there's some stuff going on between the NPA and then the Aquino family. But that does not necessarily mean they had some kind of relationship. They were kind of friends. I think they even shared a jail cell at one point. But that does not necessarily mean that they are in cahoots with each other. I can't say for sure. Again, needless to say, whatever the cause of this bombing was, in the longer term, it doesn't really matter as much because Marcos had in his mind the plan to establish martial law either way. If you look at his own diaries, as early as the end of his second term, he was already, considering how he's going to extend the longevity of his term. So regardless of whether Plaza Miranda would have bombed or would have been bombed or anything like that, I think it would have been inevitable that martial law would have been attempted to be declared anyway, regardless of the bombing. Okay, so in the months preceding the declaration of martial law, there were a lot of other bombings going around in supermarkets, in government offices, all over Metro Manila. And this was all going on in the months in June, July, August, and early September. All of these various bombings culminated in the bombing of the car of Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile's vehicle. No one was hurt, no one was injured, but this was eventually the final straw on the camel's back in the theoretical case to be made to why martial law should be declared. What does this book tell us about the Enrile bombing and the declaration of martial law? What we learn is that, according to the author, on the day of September 22nd, the day that Enrile's car was bombed, he overheard Marcos on the phone with Enrile in the morning, talking about. He said this is the phrase that he overheard Marcos saying to Enrile. He said, "Kailangan siguro may masaktan o kung mayroon mapatay ay mas mabuti. Kailangan siguro may masaktan o kung mayroon mapatay ay mas mabuti." Meaning, someone probably should get hurt, and if someone dies, it's even better. What the suggestion is that Marcos was planning to declare martial law, and he needed some kind of final event of someone getting hurt or injured or someone dying, so he can finally announce this declaration. So that evening, around 8 p.m., Enrile's car is bombed. No one gets hurt. But because of that bombing, it went all over the news. Marcos soon declared martial law. He went on TV and he said, he declared that martial law has been established and that he already signed the document on September 21st. And, right after that, over the years of martial law, September 21st is a date that we celebrate, that was celebrated as the declaration of martial law, but it was actually announced on September 23. So again, let's think about it again. He already signed the declaration of martial law on September 21. The bombing of Enrile that was used to kind of be the straw on the camel's back, last straw on the camel's back, was on September 22. And then 23 is when he announced it to the public. Why was it signed in 21, but announced in 23? This is because on September 22, he was already getting a lot of people arrested. And so he needed people to, he needed like a thing on law, like a reason for them to be arrested. And so even before he announced it publicly, martial law was already declared in paper so they can get arrested. One of the interesting things I learned from reading this is that people knew about martial law even before it was announced. So Ninoy Aquino was being interviewed, and he said that he received a document called Oplan Sagittarius that said that there was plans for how Marcos would establish martial law. He was talking about it with reporters. And in the months before he actually declared martial law, many senators and many politicians and businessmen were actually leaving the country because they knew it was about to happen, and many people stayed. And according to the author, he says that many people stayed because they wanted to be national heroes. He says that there was a badge of honor to be arrested by the military, meaning that there was a sense where they knew martial law was about to be announced, but they couldn't leave the country because they would be seen by their fellow oppositionists as betraying the Philippines. And so they knew it was happening, but they knew they needed to be arrested so that they can be part of the opposition. They continue to be part of the opposition. And so even Ninoy Aquino apparently had many phone calls. Before he was arrested, he knew he was going to be arrested, but it seems like he let himself be arrested. And that many other senators and politicians, some of them even kind of went to Camp Aguinaldo to allow themselves to be arrested themselves. And so, people knew martial law was going to happen. Many people allowed themselves to be arrested. And over the next, 8 years, maybe they didn't know how long they would be arrested for. But I'm curious to continue learning about this period in Philippine history and what exactly went on in the first few months of martial law itself. This book has been quite interesting, and I've been learning a lot, and I want to continue sharing my thoughts on this over the next few weeks, as well as we all continue to learn more about this very interesting time in Philippine history.